Against all logic, a small band of mounted knights would face an army of 80,000 and win. The year is 1683. Across the Hungarian plains, the land trembles under the march of an immense army. 150,000 soldiers head west. The sheer size of this column meant it took 3 solid hours for the entire force to pass any single point. The summer sky darkens beneath the banners of the Ottoman Sultan. At their head rides Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, leader of the most feared military machine on the planet. He has carved a bloody, destructive road through the Balkans, leaving smoking, conquered towns in his wake. Now his ambition is fixed on Vienna, the glittering prize of Central Europe. Should Vienna fall, the path into Germany would be wide open. If Vienna collapses, all of Italy will feel the shock. If Vienna yields, the divided nations of Christendom will fall one after the other, like a line of tumbling stones. The Sultan had promised Mustapha the golden apple, an ancient symbol of global domination. Europe knew what the victory meant, yet Europe did nothing. The Holy Roman Empire was frail, fractured by internal struggles and petty pride. Its emperor had already abandoned Vienna and fled. France observed from the sidelines, unwilling to assist its rival Austria. The Italian city-states argued amongst themselves. Protestant and Catholic powers were still recovering from conflicts that had ravaged the continent. The dominant nations saw only their own narrow interests. None could see the impending catastrophe about to swallow them whole. Only one man held the conviction that the looming shadow could be stopped. That man was King Jan III Sobieski of Poland. He was 60 years old, a career soldier since his youth, a veteran of dozens of battles against the Turks and Tatars, a man whose deep religious conviction unnerved those who did not share it. Where others felt desperation, he felt a sacred obligation. Where others saw impossible odds, he saw the hand of destiny calling him to stand firm. His realm was exhausted, his treasury was empty, and his standing army numbered only a few thousand. But his faith burned brighter than the dawn over the Carpathian Mountains. He sent a message to Vienna: "Hold fast, I am coming." He didn't seek permission. He didn't wait for promises of funding or repayment. He simply assembled every man who could ride a horse and began the most demanding forced march in the history of Poland. King Sobieski understood that certain moments transcend mere calculation. When civilization balances on the edge of a sword, honorable men do not calculate the cost. They simply choose to pay it. By the middle of July, the vast Ottoman host completely encircled Vienna. It was 150,000 against a mere 15,000 defenders. The walls were ancient, constructed long before gunpowder could easily breach stone. The garrison was minuscule, under the command of Count Ernst Rudiger von Sparrenburg, a man whose sheer willpower was legend and who knew they couldn't possibly win. Yet he absolutely refused to surrender. The siege operations began their deadly work. Day and night the massive cannons thundered. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels beneath the walls, causing bastions to erupt in violent smoke and fire. The desperate defenders battled fiercely for every meter of wall, for every single hour of daylight. Inside the city, time became measured by heartbeats and whispered prayers. Kara Mustafa rested inside his luxurious silk tent, eating roasted lamb and honey. While the Viennese starved, he directed the building of a tent city so immense that walking its entire length took over an hour. He invited foreign diplomats to witness the siege, as if it were a theatrical performance. He was unhurried. He believed he had already secured the victory. Time and starvation were his most reliable allies. His officers urged a rapid, full-scale assault, but Mustapha declined. Why sacrifice soldiers when the slow effects of hunger would do the job? He never looked to the north. He never considered that anyone would be mad enough to challenge him. Why did all of Europe believe that Vienna was doomed? The question was never if it would fall, but when the end would come. The city was perishing by slow degrees. Smoke hung over Vienna like a pall. The streets were deserted, save for the distant roar of artillery and the anguished cries of the wounded. Food reserves dwindled, then vanished. People resorted to boiling leather belts to create a miserable soup. Rats became a sought-after meal. The very old and the very young were the first to die, not from enemy blades, but from lack of nourishment. Clean water was running dangerously low. Disease spread rapidly, dysentery, high fevers, and wounds that wouldn't heal. Yet the people still resisted. Civilians dug trenches alongside the remaining soldiers. Elderly men stood guard on the walls. Young boys carried stones to repair the breaches. Women loaded muskets with steady, determined hands. Every sunrise, Count Starhemberg ascended the ramparts and counted the new breaches. Every morning, there were more. The Ottomans had detonated 3 enormous openings in the outer fortifications. The defenders were reduced to barely 4,000 fighting men. They had endured for a painful 2 months. They could not hold out much longer. Starhemberg wrote in his diary, "We are living ghosts protecting a tomb, but we will never give up." Outside the walls, Kara Mustafa's confidence swelled into arrogance. Merchants set up marketplaces among the tents. Musicians played in the cool evenings. In his mind, he had already allocated Vienna's immense wealth. But a significant change was happening to the north. Far past the Ottoman lines, a relief force was gathering. It was tragically small by the measure of global empires, but it moved with an absolute, desperate resolve. King Jan Sobieski had summoned every ally who would answer his desperate plea. Duke Charles of Lorraine brought 20,000 Austrian and German soldiers. The southern German princes contributed a few thousand more. And from Poland, after traveling 500 miles through mountains and storms, Sobieski led his legendary Winged Hussars south. 3,000 Polish cavalry, considered the finest heavy cavalry Europe had ever known. Knights wearing steel armor that cost more than a common peasant could earn in a lifetime. They were not enough. Even combined with the imperial forces, the Allied army could field barely 27,000 men against the 80,000 Ottomans holding the siege lines. These numbers were completely insane. It was a suicide mission disguised as military strategy. Sobieski didn't care about the numbers. He cared only for his duty. He wrote to his beloved wife, "I go to rescue Vienna. If I should die there, remember me to our children, and tell them their father perished fulfilling God's calling." Inside the beleaguered city, as August gave way to September, a numbing despair settled like a killing frost. The ancient walls crumbled faster than the people could mend them. The stores of gunpowder were nearly exhausted. The Ottoman tunnels were almost complete. Starhemberg sent his final messenger past the enemy lines on the night of September 9th with a clear, concise message. "Come immediately, or do not come at all. We have mere days, perhaps only hours." On the night of September 10th, an exciting rumor began to sweep through Vienna like wildfire. A sentry swore he saw signal fires twinkling on the far-off hills. Another claimed to have heard trumpets faintly echoing from the mountainous forest. The desperate people gathered on the crumbling walls, straining their eyes toward the north. And there, just before sunrise on September 11th, they finally saw it. Banners, thousands of them, cresting the slopes of Kahlenberg. The double-headed eagle of the Holy Roman Empire, the majestic white eagle of Poland, the standards of Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia. The relief army had actually arrived. Inside Vienna, the church bells rang out for the very first time in weeks. People openly wept in the streets. They didn't know if this small force could possibly save them, but for the first time in 2 solid months, they held the belief that they might not face death alone. A whisper spread through every quarter, every dwelling, every weary heart. The Polish king is coming. The journey south was a prayer written in sheer endurance and iron will. King Jan Sobieski had led his men across 500 miles of unforgiving terrain, through narrow Carpathian passes where summer storms transformed the paths into raging rivers of mud, through forests so dense the sun vanished for days at a time, across rain-swollen rivers. They moved with a speed unmatched by any army in history. 40 miles some days, even 50 when desperation fueled their every step. They slept while still in their saddles. They ate in the saddle because Vienna was dying and every hour was a matter of life and death. The hussars rode at the very front of the advance. These legendary knights had become a myth while they were still alive. Warriors clothed in heavy armor that shone like captured sunlight. Great wings of eagle feathers rose from their backs, mounted on wooden frames. Not merely decoration, but a terrifying weapon of psychological warfare, refined over generations. The wings made them appear unnaturally large and formidable. And the sound, that chilling, eerie, whistling sound, when 3,000 hussars charged at a gallop, was the final sound countless enemies ever heard. Each hussar was an aristocrat of war, protected from head to foot in steel plate and chainmail, carrying an 18-foot lance made of hollowed wood, light enough to balance under one arm, yet powerful enough to pierce through a man and his horse simultaneously. They were nobility. They owned vast estates. They had servants, high titles, and great wealth. Any one of them could have chosen to remain safely at home. They rode to Vienna anyway, because their honor demanded it, because their king had called upon them, because some principles matter far more than survival itself. They were, truly, the last authentic knights of Europe. At Thon, the Polish king formally joined forces with Duke Charles of Lorraine and the imperial army. Poles and Austrians, who had little affection for each other, now stood united, shoulder to shoulder. Catholic and Protestant soldiers, who should have been bitter foes, recognized each other as brothers, because Vienna was being suffocated, and if Vienna fell, they all faced the same inevitable doom. Faith and the instinct for survival fused them together. Old animosities dissolved. Nothing mattered at that moment except the monumental charge they all knew was imminent. On the evening of September 11th, the Allied army reached the dense Vienna woods. They made their camp among the trees. No fires were allowed, and no sound was heard above a whisper. At the first light of dawn on September 12th, the commanders ascended to the peak of Kahlenberg. What they witnessed below took their breath away. The sprawling Ottoman encampment stretched for miles. 80,000 men stood in perfect battle formation. Cavalry reserves numbered in the tens of thousands. Artillery parks bristled with enormous bronze cannons. The crescent banners were so numerous they seemed to form a second sky above the plain. Between the mountain and the city lay only open ground. These were deadly kill zones watched carefully by Ottoman guns. Even Sobieski, who had seen every type of battlefield imaginable, felt the sheer magnitude of the threat. 27,000 against 80,000 of the Sultan's absolute best soldiers. A younger, less experienced commander might have hesitated, might have waited for better strategic odds. But Jan Sobieski deeply understood something the Ottomans completely missed, that certain junctures in human history demand sacrifice without any logical calculation. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the unwavering refusal to let fear dictate your choices. When evil forces gather at the gates, good men do not beg for better odds. They simply pay the devastating price that virtue demands. He turned to his assembled officers. His voice was steady and calm, carrying the weight of absolute, final conviction. "Gentlemen," he stated, "we shall attack at noon. The hussars will lead the way. Go and make your peace with the Almighty." Across the Allied lines, men dropped to their knees in quiet prayer. Catholic priests offered last rites and blessings. Protestant chaplains led solemn hymns. For this singular morning, the religious divisions vanished. They were simply Christians confronting the great shadow. The hussars performed one final check of their heavy armor, tightened the girths on their saddles, tested the balance of their lances, and spoke quietly to their horses. Some quickly wrote final hurried letters home. Others simply closed their eyes and drew a deep breath, trying to memorize the scent of the morning air. At 11 a.m., the massive army began its difficult descent from Kahlenberg. First, the infantry engaged the Ottoman scouts and skirmishers. Then, the German heavy cavalry struck hard at the enemy flanks. The Austrians pressed the advance from the south. The strategy was successful, but the progress was agonizingly slow. Far too slow. Vienna was on the brink and could not wait. Inside the city, the remaining defenders launched a final, desperate, full-scale sortie, throwing their weakened forces against the siege lines in one last all-or-nothing push. If the main cavalry force didn't break through soon, the city would fall anyway. King Sobieski sat mounted atop his massive warhorse at the summit of a low, prominent ridge. Behind him, 3,000 winged hussars formed a vast, powerful wedge. 3,000 lances were lowered as a single unit. 3,000 fervent prayers were whispered into the wind. His own sons rode directly beside him, Alexander and James, their faces fixed with determined focus. The king raised his gleaming saber high, the blade reflecting the afternoon sun, and the thunder began. At noon on September 12, 1683, the sky seemed to open, not with rain or lightning, but with wings. 3,000 Polish hussars launched themselves from the ridge like a devastating hammer thrown by the very hand of God. They started at a steady trot, then increased to a canter, the powerful rhythm intensifying, the ground starting to noticeably shake. The feathered wings on their backs captured the rushing wind and produced a terrifying roar, a sound like 1,000 giant eagles diving simultaneously. And then they charged. 18,000 Allied cavalry followed swiftly in their wake. But it was the hussars who were in the lead. It was the hussars the enemy focused on first, hurtling down the steep slope like a steel-clad avalanche of sheer rage and fury. The largest cavalry charge ever recorded in human history descended upon the densely packed Ottoman lines like the accumulated wrath of ages. From the high walls of Vienna, the defenders watched the scene in stunned, silent disbelief. They had never witnessed anything remotely like it, a living, massive avalanche pouring down the steep slopes in perfect, disciplined formation. The wings flashed brilliantly in the afternoon sun, like angels descending to deliver final judgment. The Ottoman cavalry moved quickly to intercept. Thousands of Sipahi riders, the finest horsemen of the East, veterans of countless long campaigns. They had never faced the Winged Hussars before. Their resistance lasted barely 4 minutes. The Polish wedge collided with the Ottoman line with the enormous force of a collapsing mountain. The impact was so loud it was clearly audible even from the far-off walls of Vienna, a thunderclap of metal striking metal. 18-foot lances shattered as they struck the Ottoman cavalry, hurling men violently from their saddles. The hussars did not slow down. They punched a hole through the first rank, then the second, then the third. Every lance that splintered, the rider immediately discarded it, drew his heavy saber, and kept riding, kept fighting, kept killing. Behind them, the Allied cavalry rapidly expanded the breach. The entire Ottoman battle formation began to crack. First, a single unit broke and desperately fled, then another. Then an entire regiment suddenly turned and ran. Then the whole line completely shattered. Panic spread faster and further than any sword could reach. Ottoman soldiers who had held firm through brutal months-long sieges suddenly turned and bolted. Units that had never retreated in their lives fled in utter disarray. The fearsome janissaries, the elite shock troops who had never experienced defeat, frantically attempted to form defensive squares. The hussars simply rode them down relentlessly, like mature wheat before a sharp scythe. King Sobieski was present everywhere at once. His powerful warhorse was covered in blood, his saber stained crimson to the hilt, his voice echoing above the deafening chaos. His sons fought right beside him, battling like the princes they were born to be. He led from the very front, because that is the solemn duty of a king when the world is teetering on the edge of oblivion. Kara Mustafa watched his massive army dissolve into anarchy from his luxurious silk tent. The man who had promised his sultan the conquest of Europe stood utterly frozen as the unthinkable nightmare unfolded. Finally, when the hussars were visible even at that distance, he panicked and ran. He abandoned his personal treasury, his tactical maps, his own royal banner, and the golden apple meant for the sultan's waiting hand. All of it was left behind in a desperate, frantic scramble to escape the furious wrath of the winged hussars. By nightfall, the battle was completely over. 80,000 Ottoman soldiers had scattered to the winds. 15,000 lay dead on the battlefield. The remainder fled south in total, irrecoverable chaos. The greatest army the Sultan had ever amassed, utterly obliterated in a single afternoon by a force one-third its size. Vienna was saved. Europe was saved. Courage is refusing to let fear make your choices. At the setting of the sun, King Jan Sobieski rode triumphantly through the city gates of Vienna. The streets were lined with citizens weeping, cheering, and falling to their knees in thanks. Children reached out tiny hands to touch his horse's coat. Women tossed every last flower they could find. Men kissed the hooves of the hussar mounts. The citizens looked spectral, hollow-eyed from months of starvation, emaciated from disease, but they were alive. The king dismounted in the grand cathedral square, covered in battle dust, blood, and profound exhaustion. He knelt before the altar of St. Stephen's Cathedral and spoke the Latin words that would forever resonate through the annals of history. Veni, vidi, Deus vicit. I came, I saw, God conquered. Not we conquered, not I conquered, not Poland or Austria or Germany conquered. God conquered. Because Sobieski understood what some leaders forget in the fever of a great victory, that true courage is a gift from on high, that strength is drawn from wells beyond mere human flesh, that when the impossible becomes sudden reality, it is not accomplished by human hands alone. The brutal siege was broken for good. The existential Ottoman advance was permanently finished. Never again would the crescent banners pose a threat to the heart of Europe. The relentless tide of history, which had seemed utterly unstoppable just days before, had been decisively turned on one September afternoon, and the sound that shifted its course was thunder. The thunder of hooves aggressively pounding down a mountain, the thunder of wings singing in the wind, the thunder of men who simply refused to let the darkness prevail. Against every logical assumption, against all overwhelming odds, against the cold mathematics of war and the deep logic of despair, Europe was still standing. Because on that single September day, the Polish Winged Hussars rode directly into legend and carried the immense weight of civilization firmly on their backs. That day, the thunder of the Winged Hussars echoed across history. proof that courage, profound faith, and desperate unity can fundamentally shift the direction of the entire world. If this story stirred your soul, remember to hit like and subscribe for more winds of thought from history's forgotten heroes. Against all reason, against all odds, Europe stood.